Okay, so now we're going to create an app that has more than one screen. So right now when we launch our app, you can see that we have just one screen here, one interface. But let's modify this so that we can go from one screen to another. So we will first start at the login screen, and then when the user enters their credentials, they'll be brought to this screen. So in Android, if you want to move from screen to screen, it's good to have an activity for each of your screens. So here in this example, we have one activity here, which is our main activity, and it's linked to this screen, the to-do list screen. But we have other screens as well. So we have this login screen that we want to display first, and then after that, we want to move on to the to-do list screen. So in order to do that, we need to create another activity specifically for this login screen. But before I do that, just to make things not confusing, I'm going to modify the name of this activity from main activity to to-do list activity, so that at least we know that it is linked to just this to-do list screen. So I'm going to refactor, rename. Okay, so now let's create our login screen activity. So to do that, we're going to go to File, New, and then Activity. And the type of activity we want to create here is not showing here, so I'm just going to click Gallery to get the full list. So it's an empty activity that I want to create. So it's already highlighted here. I'm going to hit Next. And the name of this activity, I'm going to make it login activity. I'm going to uncheck this generates layout file because I already have a layout file that I've created for this activity. So I'm just going to uncheck this. And for launcher activity, I'm going to check this because I want this to be the initial activity that gets launched. So I'm going to make this a launcher activity because the first thing I want to see is the login screen when I open my app. Okay, so that's all I need to do here. So I'm going to hit finish. Okay, so I'm going to now link this activity to my screen. And just like how we did in this to-do list activity here, I'm going to use this set contents view function, but instead of the to-do list, I'm going to make it login. There we go. And as you know, the activity is the code or the back end that powers the UI or the screen. So I'm going to write some code for that login screen. So essentially, I want to check the user's username and password that they enter to see if it matches an expected value. And if it does, then I will let the user progress to this screen right here. But before I do that, let me just rerun my app just to make sure this is the initial screen that gets loaded. Perfect. So as you can see, because I set this as my main launcher, this is what I see initially instead of the to-do list. Okay, so now let's go back to our login screen. So instead of TreeBnB, I'm just going to change this to login. So since I'm going to be using these items in my code, I'm going to provide some names to it or some identifiers for these items. So as you can see here, this already has an ID, but let me just modify this to make it more relatable to what we're doing. So this will be called edit text username, and I'll call the other one, edit text password. And then finally for the button, I'm going to just call it button sign in. Okay, so now I'm ready to use it in my code. So I'm going to go into my login activity and I'm going to create those variables here. So now I have a variable for each element on my screen. So this is the login button, this is the username field, the password field, and then this is this login title. So now when a user clicks this sign in button right here, what I want to do is get whatever value is in this username and password field. So let me go ahead and do that here. Okay, so now what I want to do is just get the text using this get text function. But you can see here that this is an editable. Okay, so the type of this, or the type that is returned by this get text function, is not a string. And that's probably why we're getting this underline here. So I'm just going to convert this to a string using .toString. And I will do the same for the username. Okay, so now the underline is gone. Okay, so what I'm doing here is just to display the username and password that I have when I click the button, just so that I know that everything's working fine. So I'm just going to run our code. Okay, so now all I'm going to do is just enter some username and some random password. And I'm going to hit sign in. And as you can see, the username and password is being captured. Okay, so that's good so far. So now that I have the username and password, I'm just going to use an if statement to check if it matches what I'm expecting, okay? So in real life, or when your app is ready for users, of course, you wouldn't have some check like this. You would actually use a much better authenticator. But this is just for demonstration purposes, just so that you can get an idea of how a simplified login would work. So for a simplified login, we're going to manually set the username and password. So we're going to say if the username equals these characters and if the password equals these characters, then we're going to do our code for logging in and then going to the next screen. But if this is not true, or if it doesn't match, then we're just going to update this text right here that says login to login failed. And each time we click the sign in button, we want to be able to clear this, whatever text is in here. So for instance, if the user enters the wrong credentials, you want to clear what the user entered so that the user can enter some new credentials. So to do that, we're just going to set the text to an empty string. Okay, so we've done the same for the password as well. So let's test this. Before we test this, let me just also provide a message for a successful login. Okay, now suppose we enter some random username and an incorrect password, and we hit sign in. As you can see, everything gets cleared and we get the message login failed. So we're going to enter the correct username, but an incorrect password. And now if we click sign in, as you can see, because the password is incorrect, we still get login failed. So now let me enter the correct credentials. And now It says signing in. But now let's make it actually sign in, okay? And by signing in, I mean move to the next screen. In Android, we only need 2 lines of code to progress from one screen to another. And we're going to use something called intents, okay? And this is going to enable communication from one activity to the other. And we're just going to call this intent. And this accepts 2 parameters. The first one is the context, or to put simply, you can use get application context. And then the second part, which is the most important part, is the name of the file that you're trying to move to. So in this case, the class name here is to-do list activity. So in here, I'm going to put that name here. So to-do list activity dot class. And then the final line here is just start activity. And the activity that I want to start is this intent right here. That's it. So now if I run my code, I'm going to enter the expected username and the expected password. And now if I hit sign in, it goes to the activity that I specified here. So when it goes to this activity, it sets the UI to this screen over here. So what I want to do in this activity is just update this date over here. Okay, so I'm going to try to find out how to get the current date in this format. To do that, I can just do a simple Google search. And this is something that you'll most likely do quite often because as programmers, we don't have all the answers to the specific code or command for each and every single thing. So we can always turn to the internet to find out how to do things. In this case, I'm going to search for Java, how to get current date. And I always like to go specifically to Stack Overflow. So let's check out what the answers here is. So this answer here has just one line. It's not too complicated. So I'm just going to copy this and then I'm going to use it in my code over here. Okay, so I'll import the calendar. And I think I also have to import this as well. And let's try to figure this out. So I'm assuming this here means the year, the month, the day, hours, minutes, and seconds. But since I don't need hours, minutes, and seconds, I can remove this from the pattern. Let me just format it the way it's shown here. So I think this is month, and then day, comma, and then year. I think that's what it looks like. Okay, so now I should have the value stored in this variable called timestamp. So let me update this text over here to have that timestamp. First, let me figure out what the name is. Okay, it's called text view 11. I'll just change this to text view date so that it's more descriptive. Okay, so now that I have that as a variable, I'm just going to set the text to our date, or I should call it our time stamp. So now let me rerun my code to see how it looks. Okay, perfect. It's only showing the first 3 characters of the month. We can always modify this pattern to show the full month, but instead of going on the internet to search for the full thing, I'm just going to keep this as is because that's not the main objective of this tutorial. This should be enough. So the main thing I wanted to talk about is how to go from one screen to another. And let's go over the steps. So first, we ensure that there is a activity for each one of our screens. And then to go from one activity to the other, we use this line right here. We're creating an intent for the class that we want to go to. And then we use the start activity intent to go to that class. Okay, so to make things a little bit more clear, we're going to create one more activity, because when we click this plus icon over here, we want to go to another view or another screen that allows the user to enter a new item for our to-do list here. So to do that, we're just going to create a new activity. And like before, we go to our gallery, empty activity. And this one, we're going to call it add item activity. And since we don't already have a layout file for that, we're going to check this generate layout file. And we already have a name here. I'm fine with that. We don't need to modify this. And since this is not the launcher activity, we can leave this unchecked and hit finish. Okay, so as you can see here, a new activity has been created, which is pointing to this newly created layout file, which is right here. So let's go to that layout file and make the necessary modifications. So essentially what I want here is a button that is going to say add item, and then some type of input text right here where the user can enter the name of the to-do list item. Okay, so let me constrain this. And let me just modify this to say to-do item. And then the button will just simply say add. Sorry, this is the ID. Let me just make the ID add button, but the text instead should say add. Okay, so our screen here has been completed. We can add more to this later, but that is not the main objective of this tutorial. So I'm going to go back to our to-do list activity. And we mentioned here, when the user clicks this plus icon right here, is when we want it to go to the add item activity. So first, let's figure out what the name of this plus icon is. Okay, so it's called image view 4. Let me just make it the light mode. Instead of image view 4, I'm just going to give it a more meaningful name. I'll just call it image view plus. So now, if I go to the activity that is related to that screen, I can add an action to that button. Okay, so the action I want to perform is just to move to the next screen, which is the add item activity. So once again, I'm going to create an intent. I can just call it I. And now the second parameter is going to be the class name of this, which is going to be add item activity.class, and then start activity. And I name my intent I, so I'll just do start activity I. Okay, so now let's test this out. Hopefully when we click that plus icon, it should take us to the screen that would allow us to add a new item to our to-do list. So now if I was to try to add a new item, as you can see, I'm brought to the screen here where I can add something here. And if I hit add, what I want to happen is that this screen would close and then go back to the previous screen. Right now, if I click add, it does nothing. I'm going to have to manually click back for it to go to the previous screen. But I want it to go to the previous screen when I click add. So I'm going to add one thing inside my add screen. So basically this button right here, I'm going to add a listener to that one. So let me first find that button. To close this screen or to return to the previous screen, it's only one word, which is finish. So this finish function essentially closes whatever the current screen is. So now if I run this one more time, we can go from one screen to another screen, and then we can go back using that finish function. So it's working just as we expected. So later we'll add all the necessary functionality. But for now, hopefully you're getting a basic idea of how to move from screen to screen. But now what if we want to pass some data from screen to screen, okay? So suppose when a user logs in, we want to pass the user's login username to the next screen. I'm going to go to our login activity. And in order to pass some data, all we have to do is make some additions to our intent before we start the intent. So I'm just going to do intent dot put extra, and then I can just specify any key and value here. So let's say I want this to be called user name. So that's the key. And then the value would be whatever the username was, just like that. And keep in mind that this username can be whatever. It's just a key name over here. So even if I did uname, that would also work, as long as I'm calling the same key inside my next activity. So I'm just going to leave it as uname, and then the value is username. So I've attached that to my intent before I open it. So once I open that intent, I'm just going to go to our to-do list activity. Once I open this intent, I'm just going to extract that data, okay? So to do that, I would just do get intent dot get extras, get string, and then I provide a key. So this is uname. So first I'm opening my intent, getting the extra data, and then getting the specific key uname. And I'm going to assign the value to a variable. I'll just call this name. And just to show you that I was actually able to pass that data from one screen to another, I'm going to set this text here to a greeting saying hello and then the name. So it looks something like this. Okay, so I'll just say hello name, and then below it will be the timestamp. So let's try this out. Okay. So as you can see, I was able to pass the username from the login screen to this to-do list activity. The type of data that I pass doesn't only have to be a string. So for example, if instead of this username, I was passing a number 123, so the value is 123. Inside my receiving activity, I just have to specify what that type is going to be. In this case, it's string, so I'm doing get string, but it could be so many other different data types like get char, get int, double Boolean, long. So since it's going to be an integer that I'm receiving, I'm going to do get int, and then the key name, which is uname. So in that case, I'm going to have to change the data type here to int. That's why I'm getting this red underline over here. So if I change this to int, I can now receive this integer value that I passed from my login activity to this to-do list activity. Okay, so we're going to continue improving this to-do list app, but at least now we're able to move from one screen to the next. And we're also able to pass some information from one screen to another.